So this is going to require a pre-lab. There's a module that has background information as well as a link to submit. Again, it's not until Tuesday, I guess Monday night. This lab is it's usually fun to do. We need to have a couple of definitions for this to make sense. So stimulus is just some kind of energy that's out there in the universe. Right? Perception is a conscious experience of something. Right? There might be sounds around, but they're so quiet you just don't hear it, and it just seems completely silent to you. Or it could be the bats bats can hear things that are like at 100,000 kilohertz, whereas we only go up to 20,000. So to us, it's completely silent, but the bats hear all sorts of stuff because their ears can detect sounds that are 5 times as high frequency as ours. Or maybe the stimulus are radio waves, which are real energy, except you don't know they're there until you have a little instrument, your radio, which can detect and amplify the signal on the radio waves, right? So the stimulus isn't necessarily a perception, right? The stimulus is the thing, the energy. The perception is if you actually have some experience that something is there or something happened. In sensory neuroscience, there is this idea of a sensory threshold. So the idea here is even when we do have receptors that can detect something, they're only so sensitive. There could be a light so dim that you just don't see anything. It just looks black until it gets just bright enough that you notice there's some light in the room. Or maybe there's some pressure on your skin and it's so light you don't even notice anything. But then when it gets finally pushes hard enough, you notice something's pushing. Or a sound that is so quiet that you don't hear anything until it finally gets loud enough that you can, I can just hear a sound. So there's this boundary between where there's a stimulus, but it's below the ability of your sensory system to notice it. And when it just crosses over that threshold, that line where now you notice it's there. So this is going to be the minimum that is just barely perceptible. So this idea has to make sense first, right? And the way you measure it, how are you going to measure a sensory threshold?
Is it just through various amounts of stimulus? And then would it just be varying amounts of a stimulus and then your perception of whether you can perceive it?
Yeah, that's the basic part of it. If we wanted to be more more kind of step by step, how would you go about finding a sensory threshold, that minimum value where you just barely notice it?
Just slowly increase the stimulus until it's perceived.
Yeah, exactly. Did everybody hear Tim? Right? If I was trying to do this for sound, I could just keep tweaking the volume a little louder. Hear that? Not yet. A little louder. Hear that? Not yet. A little louder. Oh yeah, I hear something. Okay, so then I know that level is the threshold. That's the volume that I can just barely hear. I was doing it for touch. It's like put a little more pressure, a little more pressure. It's like as soon as there's enough that I just barely notice something's there, that is going to be the threshold. You know, in your Bio 110 lab, remember when you use like the dividers on the skin? You know, there was a distance where the dividers just felt like one, and if they were far enough apart, it felt like two. That's a threshold as well. What is the minimum distance that these two pins can be where I can still detect that they're two rather than just one? That's a sensory threshold. So what's like the minimum value? Maybe I should say minimum value of a stimulus.
Basically, just increasing the frequency.
No, frequency is something different. So frequency is going to play a role in our lab today. So we need to be very careful about the definition of frequency. So questions about sensory threshold, because this is the first idea you need to be able to kind of hold on to.
Would it be different for everyone, or is there like usually it's pretty much the same for everyone?
I think it depends what kind of sense you're looking at. And even then, it's usually there's a broad range across people within certain ranges. You've probably noticed that you're just hanging out with people and somebody hears things that you don't hear, or notices things, smells things you don't smell, or yeah. All right. So this is the first step, understanding sensory threshold. The actual thing we're going to be looking at is going to be looking at electrical stimulation across the skin. So our dependent variable So at what point, if you put little electric currents across your skin, at what point are you going to notice something is happening? So like here's your finger. We're basically going to take a current source. Which basically kind of creates a voltage difference. So there's some kind of a electrical current that goes through your skin. So this is going to be our stimulus. We're going to be able to, and we can adjust the current source. We can increase the current. We can decrease the current. Um, this is going to be our independent variable, or one of our independent variables. So one of our independent variables is going to basically be how much current are we putting through the skin here? The dependent variable is going to be the sensory threshold for actually feeling something during this electrical stimulation. How are we going to measure it? How are we going to measure measuring the IV is easy. We just turn it on the machine. We can tell the machine how many milliamps. This is in milliamps. That is electrical current. So I can tell the machine how many milliamps of electrical current I want flowing through my subject. How am I then going to figure out my dependent variable?
As the electrical current, as you increase the electrical current, then the subject will detect the pain, or it will sense.
Right, exactly. So you're going to have to start with some value of milliamps that is below what you notice, right?
Threshold.
Yeah, you have to find something below the threshold. And then, let's say it's like at 4 milliamps and you zap. Did you feel that? No. Let's put it at 5 milliamps. Zap. Did you feel that? Nope. Let's put it at 6 milliamps. Did you feel that? Nope. Put it to 7 milliamps. Zap. It's like, ooh, I felt something. Right? So then I would record that number as my sensory threshold for that condition. Right? The threshold value for the stimulus had to be 7 milliamps. That's the minimum value where I just barely felt something. When we do this experiment, we don't try to make anybody hurt. It's not going to be pain. It's just more like a little tingle. But again, the idea that the dependent variable can get a little tricky because similar to the dependent variable in the enzyme lab, it's not something we're measuring, just take a value and you got it. You actually have to do a whole process. The whole process to get a dependent variable, you have to first find the milliamps that's below threshold and then slowly increase it little by little until you barely feel it, and then record that number as the dependent variable. So this is, and actually I shouldn't say, I kind of spazzed on you here. This is not the independent variable. This is, yeah, I don't know why I'm being a spaz right now. This is still part of our dependent variable, right? The value of the current in milliamps that you just barely feel, that is my dependent variable. I vary, yeah, I'm sorry I did that to you. You're going to vary that value of current until you can barely feel it, and then record that current in milliamps as the sensory threshold for whatever condition we're looking at. Does that make sense? Yeah, sorry, I spazzed a little bit on you there. We still haven't looked at the independent variable.
Independent.
All right, so this whole picture here is all about the dependent variable. The dependent variable is we're going to put electrodes on the skin and find what milliamps can we barely feel and call that the threshold. So check. All right, now to the independent variables. There's two independent variables we're going to use. One is body location. We're going to do it on the finger. We're going to do it on the back of the calf. Right, so here we're going to do the same deal. We're going to put the electrodes on the finger, crank up the current till we just barely feel it, and call that our threshold for the finger condition. But then we can put the whole setup on the back of the calf and do the same thing and crank it till we just barely feel that and call that the threshold for the calf. Right? So the independent variable is body location. Set it up on the finger or set it up on the back of the calf. And in both cases, the dependent variable is going to be the threshold. What is the minimum current you need on the finger or on the calf to barely feel something? So does anybody have any just hypotheses out of the top of their head, which one would be probably more sensitive and why?
I think it's gonna take more stimulus on the finger because you get more thicker skin, and then the calf is more softer skin, so it's gonna take less stimulus. I mean,
It's the opposite, actually.
I think the opposite.
Right. So one of the things we haven't talked about sources of variability, but so Amato, what you're bringing up is important, is that the finger tends to have very thick skin. It's got calluses and stuff like that, which means it's probably more insulation, right? It's going to be harder for electricity to penetrate the skin, as opposed to kind of thinner skin, which is not going to be as much resistance. And that can be a problem. However, the reason why it's not an issue is because we are using a current source. And basically, no matter how thick or thin the skin is, this current source, let's say if we set this to be like 3 milliamps, it will keep changing the voltage here higher and higher until there is 3 milliamps of current flowing through the body there. You know, if we were using a voltage source, then what Amato is saying would be a real problem, would be a genuine issue, because thicker skin is going to be higher resistance, so the same voltage is going to probably cause less current. But because we're using a current source, which is going to just do whatever it needs in terms of changing the difference in voltage across these electrodes until we achieve the desired current, it actually is going to control for the thickness of the skin there. And not just, and actually on the opposite as well, sweat. Sweat would make things less, less resistant. Thick skin would make them more resistant. By using a current source, we know that we're not dealing with just the conductive properties of the skin, that we're going to be dealing with something more on a neural level underneath the skin with the receptors. So does that make sense? So what's another option?
I think that you'll reach the threshold a lot faster in your finger because you have more nerve endings there.
Right. So don't use the word faster. because when we get to the threshold, the dependent variable, it's either larger or higher or lower. It's not about speed or anything. It's
Okay.
just it's an actual value. So you'd want to like say that, I expect a lower threshold. Yeah, and so that totally does, like, we're gonna be seeing this later in one of our labs in another week or two. Yeah, but basically you have all these little receptors under your skin, touch receptors. That are all kind of getting hit by this current, and all these axons getting tweaked by the current. When you are on the back of the calf, if you remember from your general bio lab, you can have these like sticks like an inch apart. You don't even know that's two sticks or one stick. Right? So if you have the receptors and axons much more spaced out, then the same kind of current is not going to be likely to cause as much of an effect that is going to trigger something going up to your brain. So just like having that high density of receptors in the fingers compared to the calf is probably going to make a big difference. The other independent variable the frequency of the stimulus, which is how often it spits out. Like if I have my current source here, and I'm looking here, if I just do a single pulse, however, if I want it to be repeating, then I can just tell it how fast do I want it to repeat. I could say repeat twice a second, so on. I could repeat once a second. I could repeat 5 times a second. Right, so that's frequency. Frequency is how often is this little pulse coming out. We measure it in what are called hertz. Cycles per second. If I have 1 hertz, it means it's happening a 1, a 2, a 3, a 4, a 5. Every second one comes out. If I had it 2 hertz, I have 2 per second. A 1 and a 2 and a 3 and, right? If I was at 4 hertz, which would be basically like 16th notes, right? It would be like 1E and a 2E and a 3E and a 4E and a, right? It's going to be 4 pulses every second and continuing. Notice that 1 hertz is not single pulse, right? A single pulse happens once and then just ends. 1 hertz is happening once every second. Does that make sense? In fact, I have So I'm not gonna be quicker this time. Here we go. So here, this is on the nerve stimulation pre-lab module here. Introduction to the nerve stimulation lab. You can watch me and Tina talk about this stuff as well. Again, like a little 10-minute thing that reviews this again. But in here, I kind of give like a more visceral sense.
All right, so
This
little piece of gear here, we can use our main stem. This is nerve. Will always be here at point 2. Short little.
So the point, what I'm trying to show here is the difference between like a single pulse and like 1 hertz and 2 hertz. And to show it in a more obvious way, I actually hook up the electrodes to my nerve that is going to make my muscle twitch. So you can see something move. Our lab, you're not actually making anybody twitch, but this is useful just to kind of get a sense of what frequency means.
Well, pulse, the things that we are going to vary is the current, the electrical relating your, if you show my hand here, if I say send out a pulse, you can see my thumb. And if I hit, if you show my hand here, if I say send out a pulse, you can see my thumb go. So I go, I'm going to turn on the pulse. We go pulse, my thumb went. Right now, the repeat rate is at 0.1, which actually means like 1 pulse every 10 seconds. So if it's set here, if you just turn it on, you'll have a pulse. As long as you turn it off before 10 seconds is off, that'll be the same as doing a single pulse. There is no way to just tell us to do 1 single pulse, but it's the same difference if we say 0.1 hertz and then make sure we turn it off before 10 seconds have passed. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to change the frequency to 1 hertz. And you'll see it's sending out 1 pulse every second. So this is important to realize. 1 hertz is very different from a single pulse. 1 hertz means there's 1 pulse coming out every second as long as the stimulus is on. A single pulse would be there's a pulse and then nothing. I can increase it. I'm going to go to 2 hertz, which is 2 cycles per second. And now all of a sudden my finger's going twice as fast. I'm going to go right now and change it to 5. I can go even more. I can take it to 10. At this point, I'm starting to get into tetanus. It's actually getting kind of uncomfortable. So I'm going to slow it down and turn it off. So.
All right. So just to kind of give you a sense, the pulses coming out of that little machine are once a second at 1 hertz, 2 per second at 2 hertz, 5 per second at 5 hertz, which is different than a single pulse. All right, so then if we get back to our hypothesis. So again, our dependent variable is still going to be the sensory threshold. And again, how do we measure the sensory threshold for this experiment?
Milliamp.
Yeah, it's going to be how many milliamps do we need to use before you just barely feel it? But now I'm sending my independent, I'm going to vary the frequency of the stimulus. So I want to know, as frequency increases, what happens to the threshold? And what do you think? Again, it's worth kind of thinking about. Here's my finger with the little electrodes and the little things underneath. And remember, we have little neurons under here. And think about, what does this make you think about when we talk about hitting it again and again in quick succession?
So as the frequency increases, get more contraction on the muscle, and then eventually it leads to tenderness. No,
Just think about muscle. That thing I showed you on the YouTube was just to give you a sense of what frequency means with the pulses, but this is purely about sensory. This is not about muscles, right? Here we want the sensory threshold. We're gonna crank up the milliamps here until I just barely feel something. But now, instead of coming out in just as a single pulse, it comes out in a train of pulses at a particular frequency.
Like
That's
temporal
like-
summation?
I think I heard it. Say that again.
Is that like temporal summation?
Yeah, so remember, does everybody remember what temporal summation is? So
The
how,
dog pile.
it's like, yeah, so what's gonna happen if, am I gonna expect the threshold to be higher or lower as the frequency goes up?
Lower.
And why is that?
As the frequency goes up, the sensitivity goes down. So I guess that's really just saying the same thing, but I feel like the more frequent it is would make it more perceptible.
But so that's, but then we need the why. Why does that make sense?
Is it because it's already excited?
If you remember what temporal summation was, is like, right, if you hit something once, it comes down, hit it again, it comes down. But if you hit it a couple of times before it has a chance to resolve, they can start stacking on each other, right? So think about it in this case. You use a single pulse. You have to have this at a certain magnitude before it perturbs things enough that you hit some threshold where you actually feel something, some action potential goes to your brain. If I've got some smaller stimulus that doesn't help me get up above threshold, then I don't actually have anything. But if I have these smaller ones in quick succession, they might start actually adding with temporal summation. So the net effect is I actually do hit some threshold and send a message to my brain. Right? Remember that whole idea of temporal summation is if one greater potential comes on the heels of the previous one quick enough, they start having an overall greater effect than either one would have had on their own. So that means if they're adding up because of temporal summation, you're going to be able to hit some threshold, even if an individual one is not enough on its own.
So then our hypothesis is going to have two separate sections kind of.
Yeah, so your hypothesis needs to have two different predictions because there's two independent variables. Exactly. So if we kind of, right, dependent variable is always going to be, what is the sensory threshold? And again, that's going to be what is the minimum milliamps that you send out through that current source where you just barely feel something. Independent variable, we've got two. There's body location. And the other one is frequency of the stimulus. So we're going to be doing both of these. We're going to vary the body location, and we're also going to be varying the stimulus, the frequency of the stimulus. And in both cases, we can see, how does this relate to this? How does this relate to this? So that clear?
I actually have a question.
Sure.
So and back to the temporal summation, could you say that it just has a larger, like overall larger depolarization effect? Or would that not be the same as saying as the it just makes a larger action potential? Or like
No, you could say the depolarization due to having like smaller things in quick succession is likely to kind of reach the level, whatever threshold you need to feel something, with using smaller actual individual pulses, because the overall effect is additive,
okay.
right? I mean, you're going to have to bring in the concept of temporal summation, though. The reason why they're adding to make a larger overall depolarization is that they're happening in quick succession. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. I just wanted to make sure I have like the actual reason why, other than just saying it just dog piles. Like it just, yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, you're going to be able to hit some critical depolarization where, it sends a message up to your brain using a smaller individual pulse if you're using temporal summation.
Cool. Thank you.
So wrap your head around these ideas. I find this is another lab where people get confused, kind of keeping track of, oh yeah, these are the two. And remember, frequency is a independent variable. We'll set our stimulus at a particular frequency, let's say at 5 hertz. And then we will vary the milliamps up and down, or up, until what is the milliamp as the stimulus is at 5 hertz, until we just barely feel it, right? You need to make sure you understand the difference. The hertz, the frequency, is how fast the pulses are happening. The milliamps is how tall is the pulse. And the milliamps at which we just barely feel something is going to be our dependent variable for that particular value of the frequency. Right, where you literally just have your subject there, you set the little deal to like 5 hertz, and you just feel that, no, feel that, no, feel that, no, feel that, oh, got that. All right, now let's go to 10 hertz. And you go down, put the milliamps below the threshold, feel that, no, up a little more, feel that, no, up a little more, feel that, no, up a little more. Again, until they just barely feel it, and record that milliamps as the threshold for that frequency condition. So any questions?
Can we go back to sources of variability? Because you said that like the calluses and thickness of the skin wouldn't be a source of variability because of the
yeah, so sources of variability, normally you would think calluses and salt, sweat would actually be a big source of variability, but in our case it's not going to be so much because we're using a current source instead of a voltage source. What are some of the sources of variability, though, that we need to worry about?
Would one be each person's unique sensory receptors?
Right. So the fact is, everybody's probably going to be different. How do we get around that to look for these relationships? How do we control for individual differences in their sensitivity?
Test many people and then just take averages?
Well, so there's that, but I would say, no, there's this, what we call the within subject control. If we know that everybody has different sensitivities, everybody's gonna like feel things at slightly higher or lower milliamps, but we can still say, okay, for this person, whatever their particular response is, let's just compare their finger and their calf. Let's compare their skin at 5 hertz to 10 hertz to 25 hertz. And so we can still get the relationship for between the independent and dependent variable. And we don't have to worry about, well, what if this person is more sensitive than that person? It's like, well, it's the same person. So this idea of getting all of the measurements from one person helps you control for like the differences between individuals in terms of their sensitivity. And what are other sources of variability?
Could you say something along the lines of like their like energy levels or like excitement levers prior? Like if they're super anxious to do it and like could that
paying attention, right? I mean, attention is a huge thing, right? If like things can happen, it's like, whoa, I didn't see that. Did you see that? No, I guess I was just, my mind was wandering, right? If you're trying to have a perception, a conscious experience, your level of attention is going to make a huge difference on what you experience. How are we going to try to control for kind of attention and mind wandering and things like that?
Would it be just interacting with the subject to like make sure they're paying attention?
I mean, there's that. But I think more, if you want to be able to assure me, like I said, how do I know the subject was actually paying attention when they were taking this data? How could you design the experiment so you know they're paying attention?
Like you will explain to them what you're gonna do.
Or tell them, give them like a little window where, get ready, it's gonna be happening. So focus your world right now on, do you feel a twitch in your fingers? Right? You don't want to make it like feel that, because then it's just like, and if it's too long of a window, they're probably gonna like be bored. But give them like a 5-second window or something, like a 10-second window. It's like, okay, get ready. Sometime in the next 10 seconds, the stimulus is going to come and you have to tell me if you felt something. Give them a window where they can sustain their attention. They don't know exactly where it's going to happen, but it's short enough that, they're going to be able to kind of keep their attention. So we can say if they didn't notice it, it wasn't because they weren't paying attention. Right? That's a way to control for that. I mean, other things we'll talk about.
Injury.
Say that, Tim?
I said, how about injury?
Injury. So that's something, if somebody has part issues with their neurological functioning, that would probably preclude them from being a subject. So that in general, that's, whenever you're doing exclusionary criteria, you want to think about stuff like that for sure.
Understood. Thank you.
The other thing is, you were working, let me look at, I'll let you think about it. We'll discuss this a little more on Tuesday because there's a couple of more important ones, but I'll let you think about it. And obviously we still are we will finish up the reflex stuff, but we have time.